I've been at a lot of sessions in this festival, and they usually begin by introducing writers with a list of their prizes. And Michelle has asked me not to do this, so that there's not some big competition. We don't see it like this anyway, where your public profile is dependent on your prizes. However, I feel obliged to mention that Michelle has just been awarded the New South Wales Premier's Prize for Fiction, the Christina Stead Award, and the overall prize. And for a great fan like me, for an adoring fan, this is a truly important moment, because I do think that Michelle is the most accomplished novelist working in Australia today. And this is due acclamation. So I would like you to... Thank you. Okay.
It's not true. She's starting with a lie.
I'd like to introduce Michelle by talking about her books. I'll say what you probably already know, that she was born in Sri Lanka, emigrated to Australia when she was 14, studied French at Melbourne University, worked for Lonely Planet, before publishing and producing her beautiful novel called The Rose Grower in the year 2000. And I'm not sure how many people here know this book. You should. It opens splendidly, brilliantly, with a man called Stephen falling out of the sky in the year 1789, the year of the French Revolution. Is it 1789?
Yes.
In France. So an American falling from the sky, and it's a romance between a French woman and an American man. And I do remember reading this book and being astonished that such a text had come from Australia, that it was so far-fetching, so audacious in both its vision and its narrative accomplishment. I mean, it's a beautifully written, many-layered text. And I felt very encouraged, really, that a book of that sort came from Australia. This was followed up by this brilliant debut, and it was followed up by The Hamilton Case in 2004. Set in Sri Lanka, of course, still called Ceylon in the 1930s. It's a murder mystery, but it's a murder mystery like no other, because it centres on a very complicated character called Sam, who really is a sort of study in, I suppose, post-colonial consciousness, but he's very doomed, miserable, sort of wrecked by his position at this historical moment in Sri Lanka. And again, it's a text of enormous conceptual density and complication, but beautifully written. And the figure of Sam and his mother too, actually, are so sort of heartbreakingly rendered. It's an extraordinary book, which won many unmentionable prizes. Now, of course, we have The Lost Dog, Michelle's third novel, and I think it's her best novel. I think this is an extraordinary book, certainly the best novel to come out last year. It really is a remarkable achievement. And I don't want to preempt the novel too much, but I'll just say a little to sort of set the frame, as it were. It's a novel in which, like Michelle's other books, is highly original and distinctive, and works by a kind of layering of narrative effects. So at its centre is... well, actually, before I say that, it occurs to me, someone asked me yesterday here, well, tell me what kind of book The Lost Dog is. They knew I was talking to Michelle. And I found myself saying that generically it's difficult to describe, but I think of it as a mixture of a mystery and a haunting. It's an unusual text in that it's deeply mysterious. You're driven by the wish to know what's going to happen in the plot. But it's about a kind of metaphysical unsettlement about the haunting of the past. So at the basic level of plot, we have a character called Tom Loxley, who's an Anglo-Indian, moved to Australia from India when he was 10, and is haunted by his past. he's in love with a woman called Nellie Zhang, a Chinese-Australian woman, an artist figure, and they're both deeply complex and complexly rendered characters. There's a week's, this is a novel that has many layers of time, but there's a week that is the frame narrative. A dog goes missing and Tom searches for a week for the lost dog. But within this element of time, there's a sort of tunneling back into the past, so a sort of excavating process of memory. And it seems to be reminding us that the past is never concluded. The past is always hauntingly affecting us and sort of undoing us. So Tom is undone by the past. He's undone by his love for Nellie, by the search for the lost dog, and above all by his deep love and regard for his mother, who is suffering. And so these are the sort of things we're going to talk about today. There's a lot more to say, and I'm hoping Michelle will say it and not me. But I'm going to invite her to begin by reading the opening to the book, so that you can get a sense of how exquisite the prose is in this book. It's one of the most beautifully crafted novels I've ever read, and it's uniformly beautifully crafted. Most novels have sort of mushy bits or blurry bits, and the kind of precision of the intelligence works all the way through this text. So,
thank you. Thank you. Before I read, I will just formally like to thank Gail for that extraordinary introduction. She's a very generous reader, as you will have guessed. And she was living in Melbourne last year, where I live, and I had the good fortune not only to have lots of just long conversations with Gail about all sorts of things, from, the weather to films we'd seen, but she also very generously read a draft of The Lost Dog for me, and the novel benefited immensely from that reading, so thank you. So this is the beginning. Afterwards, he would remember paddocks stroked with light. He would remember the spotted trunks of gum trees, the dog arching past to sniff along the fence. He cleaned his teeth at the tap on the water tank. The house in the bush had no running water, no electricity. It was only sporadically inhabited and had grown grimy with neglect. But Tom Loxley, spitting into the luxuriant weeds by the tap that November morning, thought, light, air, space, silence, the Benedictine luxuries. He placed his toothpaste and brush on a log at the foot of the steps, and later forgot where he had left them. Night would send him blundering about a room where torchlights swung across the wall, and what he could find and what he needed were not the same thing.
Thanks. I want to... don't let me inhibit applause. This is essential, I think. I want to ask about Tom, but also about lostness, because actually I think I read a wonderful review of your work by James Leigh, and he said that there's a kind of unmentionable anagram here that the lost dog is the anagram for, and just actually when you read that, the Benedictine mysteries, I'm wondering if this is about a kind of lost God, not in any theological sense, but in the sense of a lost completion, a lost spiritual homeland, a lost center. That there's something ascetic and almost monkish about that opening with Tom that implies that something greater is lost than a dog. And I wonder if you can just talk about that.
I guess that I think of Tom as someone who has lost his past, in a sense, because he's migrated to Australia at the age of 12, has lost his childhood. He can't return easily there to the scenes of his childhood, and his life in Australia is very different from his life in India. So he's a figure who is defined by that loss, in a sense. So that's a kind of on a metaphysical level. I think the other thing for me with the dog in the book, and the lostness. Well, you know, the dog is literally lost, but there's a lot in the book about creatureliness and animality. And I suppose that sense that, especially in the West, there is such a divide between body and mind, and Tom, as an intellectual, has learned to privilege his mind. And so some of the search for Tom is also about a recovery of that, that kind of the connections that are not intellectual connections, connections that are instinctive, affinities that grow out of emotion, out of feeling, rather than purely intellectual ones. Does that make sense?
Oh, yes. I mean, there is a great deal in this book about the creaturely, about that the novel ends are just, I'm not spoiling the ending. There's a poem at the end. I'll read it since she didn't write it. But it's a tiny section from Rilke. We know what is really out there only from the animal's gaze, for we take the very young child and force it around so that it sees objects, not the open, which is so deep in animals' faces. Do you want to just talk about, and you know, we've leapt quite a way ahead, but talk about that idea that the open for Rilke has a capital O. The idea is that children and animals greet being with a sort of plenitude and vivacity that we lose as adults. We turn our backs on the open and we face death, according to Rilke. And I'm wondering if you can say a bit more about how that works in the text, and why the dog, in this symbolic way, is so central to the characters, the kind of aesthetics, the sense of bodiliness that you're getting at. Can you say?
Oh, I'll try. I guess it's connected to what we were talking about before, that again, I think of Tom as someone who has been wounded in some sense by this transition from one country to another at a fairly young age. And so a lot of what he's doing in the novel is defensive, it seems to me, and trying to protect himself from recognizing that loss. And one of the characters, the character who embodies that for him is his mother, who is in her 80s, who is in quite, she has chronic arthritis, and her decline is quite, on the one hand, very evident, but it's not something Tom can really bring himself to look at. So in that sense, he is also turning away from that whole notion of decay and death, and turning his back from everything that his mother represents to him.
Well, there's such tender scenes between Tom and his mother.
Yes,
My sense wasn't that it was a repudiation, but a kind of gradual process of trying to know how to assimilate his mother's suffering, really.
Yes, it is, but I think he also, and I don't mean to suggest that he doesn't, I'm glad you said that, you know, he does, there's tenderness in his relationship with his mother. There is, but I think the physical aspect of his mother, he does find difficult to cope with. And I think, which I think is quite a common thing, that, you know, children in general, whether or not you've migrated, find it hard, confronted with the physical decline of their parents, to accept that. And he tries to defend himself against that, I think, by pretending that he's resentful of the fact that he feels his childhood has been cut short by this transition to Australia, and I think this is common for the children of many migrants, is that often in the new country, the children take on, at a quite young age, a kind of parental role of guiding the parent through the maze of the new society. And he is, in some sense, maybe resentful is not the right word, but that he suffers the loss that of his parent in that sense.
Yeah.
That he has to take on this role at an early age. And so I suppose just when then he sees Iris in this advanced stage of actual physical decay, and, it means more responsibility for him, and yet he can't do anything to alleviate her suffering, really, which is physical and beyond his control. And I think, like many people confronted with a spectacle that is hard to bear, his instinct is to look away, and yet he can't. So, because she's his mother, she's not just someone he's seen on television.
I think one of the most powerful things about the portrait of Tom is that when he comes to Australia, he's both overwhelmed by how much is here, how much there is to consume. There's a wonderful moment where he goes into a sort of corner store and realizes that there's food just for children. There are lollies and twisties, and and there's a sort of sense of kind of wonderment at the absurdity of a place that has so much that it even produces kiddie food. And yet it's a kind of critique of this idea that coming to the new place is a form of the progress of identity. It's as though his identity is under siege. And it's a deeply sort of anguishing and difficult transition, isn't it?
Yes, I think it is. I mean, I wanted to convey that sense of wonder, so I'm glad you felt that there is just that sense of Australia. This is Tom migrates in the 70s, so we're at a moment before that whole consumer revolution. The consumer society had not really taken hold in India at that moment in time. So coming to Australia really is like coming to Wonderland, in the sense of just the availability and the number of beguiling and beautiful and useless, often, objects that present themselves to Tom. And yet I wanted to suggest that it's also, it's often, Wonderland itself is a place of wonder and it's disconcerting. It's a place of dread at the same time. Strange things happen there. You don't know how to orient yourself. So I did want to suggest that, obviously, Tom and I think of us as moving on parallel tracks, but from time to time, obviously, our experiences converge, and I am drawing on my own memories of coming to Australia in writing about that. And there's that sense that, on the one hand, of it being a wonderful adventure, which migration always inevitably is, but that, on the other hand, it's also like being somewhere where you don't have a map. You don't know quite how to get around. And things are puzzling. One of the moments I had in the text is where Tom's in Melbourne, and he's not been in Australia very long, and he sees a headline outside a news agency on one of those boards, which reads, "Pies murder swans." And what does that mean? And he has this complete moment of bewilderment where he thinks, even the language is not this. I can't even use words to get around in this place.
There's a wonderful sense in this book of the world made strange, and it continues through the whole text, not just at the moment of Tom's arrival from India, but Nellie Zhang starts finding in the gutters these little plastic fish that contain soya sauce in sushi, and she can't understand where these plastic fish are coming from and what they're doing. And they're like sort of found objects, aesthetic, extraordinary objects that she can't assimilate. And at the very end of the book, Iris, who is sort of demented by pain and really unraveling, sees one of those blow-up figures outside of car dealerships, the ones that wave in the air that are bright orange. And so there's this floating man that sort of intercepts the real. And one of the great achievements of this book for me is the way in which the texture of the oddity of being in the world of these material objects that don't make sense is so powerfully realized.